The Dominion of Veth had ruled the stars for 300 years, and in all that time, they had never failed to conquer a species. They targeted Ambassador Kethra, stood on the bridge of the flagship called Eternal Judgment, and watched the blue planet spinning slowly beneath the fleet. Earth was beautiful in a primitive sort of way, with its swirling white clouds and deep blue oceans and patches of green and brown land, masses stretching across its surface. The ambassador had seen dozens of worlds like this one, and every single one of them now flew the banner of the Dominion. 300 warships hung in perfect formation above the planet, and each one carried enough firepower to turn a continent into glass within minutes. The crew worked efficiently at their stations, running final checks on weapon systems and invasion protocols, because this was routine for them. They had done this so many times that it felt almost boring. Kethra gestured to the communications officer and said in a calm voice that it was time to deliver the message. The officer nodded and activated the transmission array, which would broadcast on every frequency the humans could possibly receive. The message was translated into every human language and sent to every device on the planet that could pick up a signal. The words were simple and direct, as they always were. Species designation: human, and you have one rotation of your world to surrender all governmental authority to the Dominion of Veth, and your military assets will be dismantled, and your leaders will present themselves for processing, and resistance will result in extinction. And reply on this frequency. To acknowledge, Kethra settled back into the command chair and waited for the response. Every species responded differently when they received this message, and the Dominion had seen them all. Some species begged immediately and offered everything they had in exchange for mercy. Others threatened and postured and made bold declarations about fighting to the last warrior before ultimately surrendering when they saw the size of the fleet. A few had actually tried to fight, and those species no longer existed. The communications officer monitored all frequencies and waited for the inevitable response. 1 hour passed, and then 2, and still the human said nothing. Kethra felt a small flicker of annoyance, because this was unusual, but not unheard of, as some species needed time to process the shock. By hour 6, the bridge crew had grown restless, and the weapons commander named Torith approached the ambassador with concern on his face. Perhaps their communication systems are incompatible with ours, he suggested. Kethra shook their heads slowly and pointed to the data streaming across the tactical display. They received it, and every monitoring station on the planet registered the transmission, and their leaders have gathered and their militaries have mobilized, and they heard us perfectly well. Then, why do they not respond? Asked Torith. Kethra had no answer for that question. By hour 12, the intelligence division began sending reports to the bridge, and each one was more confusing than the last. The humans were not panicking in the way the Dominion expected. Yes, there was chaos in their cities, but it was organized chaos with purpose and direction behind it. Factories that had been producing consumer goods like vehicles and electronics went dark for a few hours and then lit up again. Running at triple capacity, military vessels from every nation on the planet left their ports and took to the seas. Aircraft filled the skies in patterns that seemed random but clearly were not. And still the humans sent no reply. Kethra ordered a closer analysis of the human activity, and what came back made no sense at all. The humans were not evacuating to shelters or fleeing to remote locations, as conquered species usually did. Instead, they were reporting for duty. Millions upon millions of them streamed toward factories and military bases and research facilities and government buildings. Old soldiers who had retired decades ago emerged from their homes in uniforms that barely fit anymore. Scientists abandoned whatever projects they had been working on and rushed to work on something else entirely. Resources flowed across borders between nations that had been enemies for centuries, and they did so without negotiation or payment or bureaucracy. It was as if the entire species had received the same silent command and responded as one. Torith studied the data with growing unease. and admitted that he had never seen anything like this. The intelligence officer added more troubling details and explained that humans sleep patterns showed something remarkable. 80% of adult humans had simply stopped sleeping since the transmission arrived. They were not showing signs of panic or terror, and their stress hormones were elevated but controlled. Their movements were purposeful and coordinated, and they worked with the kind of focus that the Dominion had only seen in hive mind species. But humans were not a hive mind, and they were individuals with free will, and yet somehow they were all choosing to do the same thing. They were preparing. Kethra asked the obvious question, which was preparing for what exactly? No one had an answer. The hours continued to pass, and the deadline grew closer, and still no transmission came from Earth. Kethra had the communications officer check and recheck all systems, and everything was functioning perfectly. The humans could respond at any time, and they were simply choosing not to. As the final hour approached, Kethra made a decision and opened a channel to broadcast the final warning species designation. Human, and your time has expired, and you will now. The channel closed. The communications officer stared at the console in disbelief and reported that the humans had terminated the connection. From their end, they had received the transmission, and they had the capability to respond, and they had chosen to hang up on the Bleo. Dominion of Veth. Kethra felt something cold move through their body, and it took a moment to recognize the sensation. As fear, in 300 years of conquest across 11 species and countless worlds, no one had ever hung up on the Dominion begin the bombardment of their largest population center as a demonstration. Kethra ordered while trying to keep their voice steady. Perhaps they simply needed motivation to speak. The weapons officer began to comply, but then stopped and said that the ambassador should see something. On the tactical display, something was rising from the surface of Earth. Not one something, but thousands of somethings, crude vessels by Dominion standards with chemical propulsion and fragile hulls and weapons that could barely scratch the paint on a Dominion cruiser. But there were thousands of them. That is impossible, whispered Toreth as he stared at the display. Our intelligence confirmed they had perhaps 200 orbital-capable craft 3 days ago. And where did all of these come from? Kethra watched the human fleet rise toward them and felt that cold fear spreading. Further, your intelligence said. Kethra slowly and deliberately clearly underestimated what these humans are capable of. The ambassador looked at the thousands of ships climbing toward them, and for the first time in a very long career began to wonder if the Dominion had made a terrible mistake. The humans still had not said a single word, and somehow that silence was more frightening than any threat could ever be. The Dominion of Veth had protocols for everything, and they had spent 3 centuries perfecting their methods of conquest. They knew how to respond when a species begged for mercy, and they knew how to counter when a species made threats. They had strategies for negotiation and plans for preemptive strikes and procedures for accepting immediate surrender. What they did not have was a protocol for being completely and utterly ignored. Kethra paced the bridge of the Eternal Judgment while the tactical officers tracked the rising human fleet. This is unprecedented, the ambassador muttered while studying the data. Streams flowing across every display. Every species we have ever encountered has attempted communication in some form. Even the Hollow of Keth Prime, who had no concept of spoken language and communicated only through chemical signals, found ways to signal their submission. These humans have the technology to speak to us, and they simply choose not to. Weapons Commander Toreth offered an explanation and suggested that perhaps the humans were too primitive to truly understand the threat they faced. Perhaps they did not comprehend that the fleet above them could end their entire civilization in a matter of hours. Kethra dismissed this idea immediately and pointed to the tactical readouts. They understood the threat well enough to mobilize their entire species in less than a day. Look at what they have accomplished in such a short time. The data was genuinely inexplicable and defied everything the Dominion knew about primitive species, human. Industrial output had increased by 300% in just 18 hours. Factories that should have taken weeks to retool had somehow converted to military production overnight. Shipyards that normally took months to build a single vessel had produced dozens of crude but functional spacecraft. The coordination required for such a feat should have been impossible for a species that did not possess faster-than-light communication. And yet the humans had died without apparent effort or complaint. The intelligence division continued sending reports, and each one added to the mystery. Human sleep patterns showed that the vast majority of adults had not slept at all since the ultimatum was delivered. Normally, this would result in decreased cognitive function and increased error rates and general chaos. Instead, the humans seemed to be operating at peak efficiency, with fewer mistakes than normal. Their stress hormones were elevated, which was expected given the circumstances, but those hormones were being regulated somehow and kept at levels that enhanced focus rather than causing panic. Medical facilities across the planet reported almost no cases of anxiety attacks or mental breakdowns. Instead, humans who had previously suffered from such conditions were presenting themselves for work alongside everyone else. One intelligence officer noted something that made Kethra stop pacing entirely. The humans appear to be experiencing a collective emotional state that we have no translation for. The closest approximation would be something like quiet fury or cold determination. They are not afraid of us, Ambassador. They are angry at us. Kethra considered this and found it deeply troubling. Fear was useful because fear made species predictable and easy to control. Anger was more dangerous because angry species sometimes did foolish things. But this was not the hot, reckless anger that led to stupid mistakes. This was something else entirely, and it felt calculated and patient and implacable. The ambassador ordered a full sensor sweep of the human fleet as it continued to rise from the planet's surface. What came back was almost laughable in how primitive it was. The human vessels were using chemical rockets for propulsion, which was technology the Dominion had abandoned thousands of years ago. Their hulls were made of simple metal alloys that would crumple under a single shot from a plasma lance. Their weapons appeared to be kinetic projectiles and crude missiles, and some kind of directed energy weapon that could barely penetrate standard shielding. By every metric, the human fleet was pathetic and should pose no threat whatsoever to the assembled might of the Dominion. And yet something about those thousands of rising ships made Kethra deeply uncomfortable. Torith noticed the ambassador's expression and tried to offer reassurance. They cannot possibly hope to defeat us with such primitive technology. This must be some kind of symbolic gesture of defiance before they inevitably surrender. Perhaps they need to show their population that they tried before admitting defeat. Kethra shook their head and replied that if that were the case, the humans would have transmitted something by now. They would have made speeches about fighting to the last and dying with honor, and all the other things that doomed species said before the end. But these humans had said nothing, and that silence meant something. A new report arrived from the Surface Intelligence Team, and it contained footage from one of their embedded agents. The video showed a human military facility where soldiers were boarding transport craft. The soldiers moved with quiet efficiency, and there was no shouting or chaos or dramatic farewells. Families stood nearby watching their loved ones prepare to fly into almost certain death. What struck Kethra most was the complete absence of wailing or begging or desperate embraces. The families simply stood and watched, and some raised their hands in what appeared to be a gesture of respect or farewell. One child, who could not have been more than 10 years old in human terms, stood perfectly still and watched their parent board a ship. The child's face showed no tears and no breakdown, and only that same quiet fury that the intelligence officers had described. When the parent disappeared into the ship, the child turned and walked away with purpose in their stride. The agent following the child tracked them to a community center where hundreds of other children were gathering. There, the children began sorting supplies and preparing equipment and doing whatever small tasks they could to contribute to the war effort. Not one of them cried or complained or asked why this was happening. They simply worked. Kethra turned off the display and stood in silence for a long moment. These humans know they cannot win, said the ambassador finally. They know their fleet will be destroyed and their people will die. And they are going to fight anyway. And they are not going to give us the satisfaction of hearing them scream. The bridge crew exchanged uncertain glances because this was not how conquered species were supposed to behave. The human fleet continued to rise, and the Dominion fleet prepared for what should have been easy slaughter. But somewhere deep in the back of Kethra's mind, a voice whispered that nothing about this conquest was going to be easy. The silence from Earth continued unbroken, and that silence spoke louder than any words ever could. The human fleet was unlike anything the Dominion had ever faced in 3 centuries of interstellar conquest. It was not a proper military formation, but rather a chaotic swarm of mismatched vessels, rising from every corner of the blue planet below. Military spacecraft flew in loose formation alongside, cargo ships that had been hastily converted for combat, passenger vessels that normally carried tourists between cities, now bristled with weapons welded onto their hulls. Even the primitive space station that the humans had maintained in orbit had detached from its position and was moving toward the Dominion fleet. Its surface was covered with equipment that had clearly been installed in the last few hours, satellites that had spent years doing nothing but relaying communications had been fitted with explosives and were being guided toward the alien ships. It was a mongrel armada assembled from anything and everything that could reach space weapons, Commander Torth surveyed the approaching mass of human vessels and felt confident by every tactical measure. This should be a slaughter, he announced to the bridge crew. Their ships are fragile and their weapons are primitive, and they have no shields worth mentioning. Single cruiser could destroy hundreds of those vessels before taking any meaningful damage. Ambassador Kethra said nothing and simply watched the human fleet draw closer. The order was given, and the Dominion fleet opened fire. Plasma lances cut through the void and struck the first wave of human ships with devastating accuracy. Each hit was a kill, as the fragile human vessels could not withstand the superheated energy that tore through their hulls. Explosions bloomed in the silence of space as dozens of ships died in the first seconds of the engagement. The bridge crew relaxed, as this was exactly what they had expected. The humans were brave, but bravery could not overcome such a massive gap in technology. This would be over quickly. And then the real work of conquest could begin. Then the human vessels reached their targets. The tactical officer was the first to understand what was happening and shouted a warning that came too late. The humans were not trying to win this battle in any conventional sense. They were not even trying to survive it. Each human ship was a delivery system for a simple payload, and that payload was nuclear weapons. The crude atomic bombs that humanity had developed less than a century ago were now strapped to every vessel in their fleet. The first Dominion cruiser died when 17 human ships crashed directly into its hull and detonated. Simultaneously, the shields were designed to deflect energy weapons, and they barely slowed the kinetic impact of physical objects traveling at tremendous speed. The nuclear explosions that followed overwhelmed the remaining defenses, and the cruiser vanished in a chain reaction of fire. "They are ramming us," screamed Torth as he stared at the tactical display in disbelief. "That is not a tactic, and that is not warfare, and that is suicide." Kethra watched another cruiser disappear in atomic fire and spoke quietly. "That is not suicide, Commander. That is a message across the Dominion." Fleet chaos began to spread as crews realized what they were facing. These were not soldiers fighting a battle they hoped to win. These were weapons with human pilots who had already accepted their deaths. A human transport ship took a direct hit from a plasma lance that should have destroyed it completely. The vessel broke apart and flames consumed most of its structure. But the cockpit section remained intact and continued on its trajectory toward a Dominion destroyer. The pilot was certainly dead or dying, and yet somehow the ship kept moving toward its target. It struck the destroyer's engine section, and the nuclear payload detonated, and another Dominion vessel died. Reports flooded in from across the fleet as the same scene played out again and again. Human pilots flew directly into weapons fire, using their dying ships as shields for the vessels behind them. When their weapons systems failed, they simply aimed for the nearest enemy and accelerated when their engines failed. They used maneuvering thrusters to maintain course. When all systems failed, they kept coming on momentum alone. One Dominion captain reported that a human pilot had ejected from a destroyed ship in a pressure suit. The pilot used a handheld thruster to continue toward the nearest enemy vessel. They were carrying a bomb in their arms. The captain had watched in horror as the pilot impacted the viewing port of his bridge, and the explosion killed 17 crew members and threw it all there. Were no transmissions from the human fleet, no battle cries or war songs or declarations of defiance, no pleas for mercy or offers of surrender, no final messages to loved ones or prayers to whatever gods they worshipped, just silence. The only sounds came from the Dominion side, as officers shouted orders and crew members screamed warnings and dying sailors cried out in fear. The humans died without a sound. One tactical officer noticed something in the attack patterns and called for attention. "They are targeting our retreat vectors," she announced. "They are not trying to destroy the fleet. They are trying to trap us here." Kethra looked at the tactical display and saw that she was right. The human attacks were concentrated on the edges of the Dominion formation. They were sacrificing themselves in waves to cut off any path of escape. They wanted to hold the fleet in place, and they were spending their lives by the thousands to do it. "Why would they trap us here?" asked Torith. "They cannot defeat us even with these suicide tactics. They will run out of ships before we run out of defenses." Kethra understood, and the realization was like ice in their veins. "They are not trying to defeat us today, Commander. They are trying to bleed us. They want us to remember this. They want every survivor to go back to the Dominion and tell everyone what happened here. They want us to know what it costs to threaten their world." The battle raged on, and the humans kept dying, and they never said a word. On the Dominion crews, who had conquered 11 species across 3 spiral arms, began to feel something they had never felt before. They began to feel afraid. The battle lasted 16 hours, and when it was over, the void around Earth was filled with the wreckage of thousands of ships. The Dominion had lost 93 vessels, including 2 of their prized heavy cruisers. The humans had lost over 4,000 ships of various sizes and classifications. By any conventional measure, it was a devastating defeat for humanity. Their fleet was gone, and their orbital defenses were shattered, and the planet lay exposed to whatever the Dominion wished to do. But the Dominion fleet was retreating. Kethra stood on the bridge of the Eternal Judgment and watched as ship after ship broke formation and turned away from Earth. No order to retreat had been given, and no tactical reason existed for withdrawal. They still had more than 200 warships capable of reducing the planet to ashes. The crew simply refused to go forward. Reports came in from across the fleet, and each one painted the same picture. Hardened warriors who had fought in 100 campaigns sat weeping at their stations. Veterans who had shown no fear in the face of death requested immediate transfer to any posting that would take them away from this system. Medical bays were overwhelmed with personnel reporting symptoms that the doctors had never seen before. The Psychological Operations Division gave it a name and called it Kethvar. The closest translation in human terms would be the silence that kills. It was not a physical ailment, but a mental one. It was the weight of what they had witnessed pressing down on minds that could not process what they had seen. Kethra had expected many things from this battle. The ambassador had expected screaming as humans died in the cold vacuum of space. There should have been begging as pilots realized their ships were doomed. There should have been weeping transmissions to families left behind on the planet. There should have been all the sounds of a species facing extinction. Instead, there had been nothing. Human pilots had flown their ships directly into enemy fire without a single cry of fear. They had crashed into Dominion vessels and detonated their weapons without any final words. Even the civilians watching from below had not transmitted prayers, or pleas, or curses. The silence was absolute, and it was intentional, and it was devastating. Torath approached the ambassador with a data tablet containing casualty reports, 93 ships. Lost, he said in a voice that was barely steady over 12,000 crew members dead or wounded. This is the worst single engagement in Dominion history. Kethra nodded and felt the weight of those numbers. The humans had paid a much higher price, but they had accomplished something remarkable. They had hurt the Dominion. They had proven that the great conquering fleet could bleed, and they had done it without acknowledging the Dominion as worthy of a single word. The communications officer interrupted with a report that made everyone on the bridge stop what they were doing. Ambassador, we are receiving a transmission from the surface. Kethra spun around and demanded to know if the humans were finally speaking. The officers shook their head and explained that the transmission came from their own intelligence team on the ground. One of the agents embedded among the humans had managed to send footage from a major city. The display activated and showed a public square in one of the larger human population centers. The city should have been in chaos after what had just happened. Instead, the square was filled with thousands of humans standing in orderly rows. They were not celebrating because there was nothing to celebrate. Their fleet had been almost entirely destroyed, and thousands of their people had died. They were not mourning, either, at least not in any way that Kethra could recognize. There were no wails of grief or dramatic displays of sorrow. The humans simply stood and watched as something took shape in the center of the square. Workers moved with the same quiet efficiency that had defined everything about this species since the ultimatum arrived. They passed materials from hand to hand and welded and lifted and shaped. A monument was rising from the ground. It was not grand or elaborate by Dominion standards. It was a simple column of dark stone with words being carved into its surface. The embedded agent focused on the inscription, and the translation software struggled to render it properly. The words finally appeared on the display. For the stars we will claim, for the children who will claim them, for the silence that spoke our answer. Kethra read the words again and felt that same cold dread that had been building throughout this entire engagement. The humans were not mourning their dead. They were honoring them. They were already looking forward to the next battle. The agent panned the camera upward and showed the rooftops surrounding the square. On every building, humans stood watching the sky. Their faces showed no fear and no despair and no resignation. They showed patience. They showed certainty. They showed absolute confidence that this was not the end, but only the beginning. Kethra understood in that moment what the silence truly meant. The Dominion had sent a message demanding surrender, and the humans had responded. Their response was not words, but deeds. It was not a plea for mercy, but a promise of war. It said, "We do not fear you." It said, "We do not respect you enough to waste our breath on you." It said, "You are not conquerors to us, but merely obstacles to be removed." It said, "We will remember this, and we will come for you when we are ready." The ambassador turned to the fleet commander and gave the order to withdraw. To the edge of the system, Torath protested that they still had the firepower to complete the mission. Kethra silenced him with a look that carried the weight of everything they had witnessed. "We could destroy them," said the ambassador. "But what would we be destroying? Not a species that fears us, not a population we could control. We would be destroying a species that would remember, and that would rebuild, and that would never ever forgive. And we would have to kill every last one of them, because any survivors would spend the rest of their existence preparing for revenge." The fleet withdrew, and the humans watched them go from their rooftops. The silence remained unbroken, and the Dominion of Veth began to understand that they had made a terrible mistake. The Dominion High Council had not convened an emergency session for 80 years. The last time had been during the Keth Rebellion, when 3 conquered species had coordinated an uprising that took decades to suppress. Now the 11 most powerful beings in the Dominion gathered in the Great Chamber while 300 conquered species watched through secured communication channels. Ambassador Kethra stood before the council and prepared to deliver the most difficult report of a long and distinguished career. The council first spoke in the formal manner reserved for matters of grave importance. You were given command of 300 warships and the authority to conquer a primitive species on a single world. And you return, having lost nearly a third of that fleet and with the primitives still unconquered. Explain yourself. Ambassador Kethra took a breath and began. We can destroy them. The statement hung in the air for a moment. Our remaining fleet is more than sufficient to sterilize their world and end their species forever. Their defenses are shattered and their fleet is gone, and they have no way to stop us. The council stirred with confusion, because if this was true, then why had the ambassador ordered a retreat? But I must advise against it, Kethra continued. Advise against it, repeated the council first with clear displeasure. You would leave them unconquered after the losses they inflicted on us. You would leave our defeat unavenged. Kethra chose the next words very carefully. What I witnessed in that system was unlike anything in our 300 years of conquest. The humans have no faster-than-light capability and cannot reach us even if they wanted to. They have no energy shields, and their weapons are primitive, and their ships are fragile, and their lifespans are short that they barely qualify as sentient by our standards. And in 3 days, they built a fleet from nothing. They sent their people to die without hesitation or complaint. They did not beg or negotiate or plead or surrender. They simply answered our ultimatum with action. One of the council members spoke up and asked what exactly this answer had been. Kethra turned to address them directly. When we threatened them, they did not waste breath on words. They built, they armed, they came for us. And when they died still reaching for our throats, silent as the void, silent as death. Silent as a species that had already decided we were beneath contempt. The council chamber was quiet as the weight of these words settled over everyone present. Another council member asked the obvious question. You recommend we leave one primitive species unconquered when we have crushed 11 others far more advanced. Kethra nodded slowly. I recommend we leave them alone, completely and permanently alone. The council first demanded an explanation, and Kethra provided one. In our history, we have conquered species that begged for mercy, and we have conquered species that fought bravely. We have conquered species that surrendered wisely, and species that resisted foolishly. We have never encountered a species that simply refused to acknowledge our relevance. They did not respond to our ultimatum, because responding would have suggested we mattered. They did not speak during battle, because speaking would have been a waste of precious breath. They died in silence, because even their deaths were not about us. Their deaths were about their own future. The ambassador paused and looked at the assembled leaders of the Dominion and the representatives of 11 conquered peoples. When we sent our ultimatum, we taught them something. We taught them that we were a threat. In 3 days, they learned how to fight us, with nothing but primitive technology and raw determination. In one battle, they learned our tactics and our weapons and our weaknesses. Now imagine what they will learn in a generation. Imagine what they will learn in a century. The council first leaned forward and asked what Kethra expected would happen if the humans were left alone. They will develop faster-than-light technology, said the ambassador. It may take them decades or it may take them centuries, but they will find a way, and when they do, they will spread across the galaxy. They will find us eventually, and when they do, they will remember this silence. They will remember what we did and what they chose not to say, and they will answer us then as they answered us now, not with words but with deeds. One of the conquered species representatives spoke up for the first time. You fear them. Kethra turned to face the speaker and nodded without shame. I watched their pilots fly into certain death. Without flinching, I watched their civilians stand on rooftops and stare at the sky with patience instead of fear. I watched them build a monument to their dead while our fleet still hung above their world. They are not like us, and they are not like any species we have conquered. They are something new. The council deliberated for many hours while the galaxy watched. In the end, the vote was unanimous. The Sol system was declared a forbidden zone. Humanity was designated as a Class Omega species with the notation, "Do not engage." Under any circumstances, the remaining fleet was ordered to withdraw immediately. Any Dominion vessel approaching within 1 light year of the human homeworld would be destroyed by the Dominion itself. Years passed, and then decades, and then centuries. Human vessels eventually did achieve faster-than-light travel, just as Kethra had predicted. They spread across the stars and met other species and built alliances and made enemies. When they encountered species that had been conquered by the Dominion, those species often asked the same question: why did the Dominion leave your world alone? The humans rarely answered directly because they preferred to let others draw their own conclusions, but the records of the Dominion were eventually made public. And other species read the account of what had happened in the Sol system. They read about the ultimatum and the silence and the battle and the retreat. They read about the suicide attacks and the quiet fury and the monument built while the enemy still watched, and in the margin of the original threat assessment they found a notation added by Ambassador Kethra many years after the battle: a final summary of everything the Dominion had learned about humanity in those terrible days. Humanities. Reply: silence threat level absolute. Kethra lived long enough to see human ships traveling freely among the stars. The old Ambassador was retired by then, living quietly on a small world far from the centers of power. One day a human vessel arrived in orbit and a single human descended to the surface. The human found Kethra sitting in a garden and approached without hostility. The ambassador recognized the uniform and the insignia and understood that this was someone of importance. The human sat down across from Kethra, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Finally, the human smiled and broke the silence with a question. Would you like to know what we would have said? Kethra considered the question carefully and realized that, yes, the answer to that mystery would be welcome after all these years. The human leaned back and looked up at the sky filled with stars. We would have said exactly what we said. Nothing, because you were never worth our words, only our actions. The human stood and nodded respectfully and returned to the ship in orbit. Kethra watched them go and understood at last what the silence had truly meant. It had not been a failure to communicate. It had been the most eloquent message the universe had ever heard. It said we are humanity. It had said we do not speak to those who threaten our home. It had said we answer with fire and fury and the silence of those who know exactly what they are doing. And the galaxy had finally learned to listen.